Hello, this is Mark Mitchell again, and I hope you're having a good day. Today, I'm going to be discussing Chapter 11. Chapter 11 is about gender and sexuality, so it's full of a lot of interesting topics to discuss, as our next slide indicates. I'm going to distinguish between sex and gender, and then look at a lot of socialization, culture, power, and gender inequality, and all the way down to a changing world. Our chapter also includes some interesting articles related to a lot of the topics and ideas that are presented in the chapters always. And so we'll start here with just some beginnings, definitions that our book provides and does a good job of giving some examples. So for example, sex refers to more of the biological distinction between males and females, so your chromosomes, for example. And then gender is the social difference between men and women. So that's really a big difference. And just notice when you're reading in magazines or books or in video or media examples, how often these two terms are used. So our book concludes, and I think it's correct, that biology makes us male or female, and culture teaches us to be men or women. Our book mentions there with the biology of sex, primary and secondary sexual characteristics, and those that are involved in reproduction, like pregnancy, for example. And then secondary sex characteristics help further distinguish men and women. So for men, beard growth, for example, would be one of those secondary sex characteristics, or muscle mass in males being more prevalent than what it is for females. And then there are some people who are born with both sexual organs, and that is the intersexed individual, typically fairly rare, but it does happen. Our book also mentions that just a little bit. All right, and when it comes to the limits of biology, our book lists some of the differences that we can see between males and females, and they give, again, some good examples. One that's not in our book that I have traditionally read about is that males typically are more aggressive, at least physical aggression, than females at typically all ages of the lifespan, whereas females tend to be a little more verbally aggressive than men. But the examples our book uses there is when it comes to balance and coordination, do women seem to have a better amount of this ability than men? And for example, if you were to use high heel shoes, who could walk better in them, men or women? And if you conclude, hey, because women walk better in high heel shoes, do they have better coordination and balance and all that? Really wouldn't tell you that, because women are used to wearing, or at least some women wear high heel shoes, and they have developed the ability to walk in those shoes. Whereas maybe the example in our book with males is usually you read that males have better spatial abilities than females do, and maybe that is again something that's learned, and males have more experience with activities like that than women do, and so you would expect them to perform better on some of those tasks. But if you had men who had more experience with shoes that were like high heels, or girls that played more video games and developed their spatial skills, then would you see a difference in their ability to perform on these tasks? And that's where maybe we would have to say no. So despite the hype and differences about males and females, there's really a lot of similarities that go on quite a bit of time. Now, there are some differences that are biological in nature when it comes to men and women, but often a lot of these differences are exaggerated to points that they really don't exist. Our book does mention gender as a social construction, so some things that are created. So gender in different time and then in a different culture are mentioned. Our book gives us, again, some good examples. So in a different time in the United States, and of course still around the world, women don't have as many rights. So the one our book focuses on is women lacking the right to vote at, say, 100 years ago. And then, of course, we can look at many different things around the world and still see where women don't have as many rights as those who live in the United States. Gender in a different culture really picks up on some of those distinctions there. And for example, in some foreign countries, women make up a lot of the college age population, but yet they're still not allowed free reign into whatever occupation they want to choose, and maybe not some of the same social rights that women in the United States have been enjoying for a long time. So in Saudi Arabia, for example, our book highlights some of those problems, and even driving was one that until recently, as I understand it, women in Saudi Arabia were not really allowed to do that. But then several years ago during the Arab Spring, there were a lot of rights that were given in order to keep the peace, so to speak. Rulers wanted to stay in power, and so that's how one of the ways you can kind of bribe the population to stop revolting. Our book switches to gender identities and transgendered people. And so, again, keep in mind those definitions of sex and gender. But our book gives us several definitions to be aware of. So, gender identity. And there's been a lot of discussion about this now. Usually, when it came to sex, it was considered a binary trait. And now a lot of discussion on whether we should do that or not. I'm not sure if you'd seen it, but I know there was a new acronym that I think was in late 2017, but everybody's probably familiar with LGBT or LGBTQ, but you can see the rest of the abbreviation is listed there as well, to include now lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, ally, and pansexual. So a lot more abbreviations added to that acronym. All right, but simply, in the past, you were either male or female, or for a majority of the past, and that thinking is at least starting to change, and that's why we have so many acronyms today, because of the difference in thinking. All right, but the identification is how someone does that, and in our book, on page 271, they have a person who is listed there and shows a non-binary identification. So on this passport document, instead of being male or female, now we have a biological male who wants to live or appears to want to live as a female, but has other listed on their document instead of male or female. All right, but transgender, notice that term from transsexual. Transsexual there, the person going across from one sex to the other that would actually change their genitals. So I think probably one of the most famous individuals in the United States right now was formerly known as Bruce Jenner, now Caitlyn Jenner, but is actually, as I understand it, has gone through that process. One term our book does not list is a transvestite, but that would be somebody who cross-dresses, and that was one that was just not listed there, but probably could be included. Our book just shows us different types of masculinity, again by race and class, and we see maybe a lot of similar traits that you might could deduce from the pictures that are included there on page 272 in our book. Our book goes through quite a bit of the relationship between gender and power. We've got a nice illustration on page 273 about boys and girls, and how it's kind of listed there as a dichotomy, and maybe a lot of people wouldn't have to go through so many problems if some of these stereotypes that we're looking at, for example, or not using being sexist about it, was in play. All right, our next slide here talks about how we actually come to learn gender, and we have seen in chapter 7 about socialization. That's one of the processes that we have seen, and then talking about statuses and roles, and so that certainly applies here to gender. Again, the social aspect of being male or female, or becoming a man or a woman, boy or a girl, depending on kind of what age, but often includes the 4 things that are on our slide, our PowerPoint slide. appearance, which clothing, hairstyles, jewelry, things like that that distinguish or typically distinguish between the sexes. Activities there, which you might also include with behaviors and emotions, but typically who loves to shop, who uses sorts of tools or yard work or things like that. With the behaviors and emotions, when you think of nurturing and being passive versus aggressive and emotional, tough or soft, which gender do you apply that to? And then aspirations in terms of, what should you do as you get older, as you become an adult? What should be some things that would make your life fulfilling? Those different types of aspirations. Our book has an interesting section on doing gender, and so that follows up on some of the things we just talked about. But, how do you do gender when you're walking, when you're sitting, when you're going about your normal routine daily events? Often there is a way for it to be masculine or for it to be feminine. And, depending on whether we are in agreement with acting masculine or feminine, we have become really good at doing gender in our everyday life. And if you actually want it to feel weird, try behaving like the opposite sex for a while when you're walking or when you're sitting or in a number of things, eating, grooming, or whatever it may be. And then you might start to have an appreciation for what you have learned in many years and for the opposite sex as well. But that's kind of a strange term, but we know what it means in our everyday lives. All right, now we can also break this down when it comes down to individual interactions. When we think of roles that are appropriate for males or females. For example, one that we're probably usually accustomed to when it comes to a college campus or something very similar to that, maybe a store or whatever, is maybe a young man will open the door for a young lady or something along those lines. But, it'd be interesting if you change that up and for example, instead of, maybe a female opens the door for a male instead of the opposite. When it comes to interactions within institutions, our book mentions there some examples at a hospital and how male physicians and female nurses interact one to the other, in which the nurses, when they were asked to do a task by the male physician, didn't hesitate. It just seemed to be kind of normal within the flow of what they were used to. But yet if a female doctor told a female nurse or subordinate to do a task, the doctor often struggled with it. So those were some interesting interactions when it came within the hospital. It just shows, for example, that females seem to have a little bit harder time giving other females orders unless they had worked together for a number of years beforehand. All right, when we look at the next slide on the topic of socialization and structural context, we see, for example, gender socialization from birth, and so we're all familiar with this, I think. But the idea, is what color is associated with newborn females. And, of course, a lot of people might say pink, and we say, what color is associated with newborn males, might say blue. And then there are some studies that when parents have a newborn child and they will describe it, well, if it's a girl, she's soft, she's cute. We use all types of things, descriptors that seem to be female. And then if it's a son, he's strong. He's going to be able, to use all these terms that we would use with males, healthy and things like that, but there's really not a whole lot of difference in people at that age when they're male and female, not much at all. But yet that's the point of gender socialization from birth, is we're going to categorize you in one way throughout the other. Now this continues as you get older, and our slide mentions it's gender socialization throughout childhood. So the type of toys and activities, there's some for girls, some for boys. And it seems like, we are steered into one category or the other. Now, I think it's been about 2 years now, but Target, the department store Target, Even in their store, they had pink to show you, hey, these are girl toys, and blue, these are boy toys. But at one point, they tried to get rid of that, and there was a lot of backlash. A lot of customers did not like Target trying to do that. But this aligns perfectly with some of the things our book is trying to get across to us. Teaching gender in school, and our book has a section on that, and really talks about some of the negatives that girls are going to experience because of their socialization and developing, feminine traits and all that, and maybe highlight some of the advantages that boys experience. I have listed in Blackboard another video that basically takes the opposite approach, but it shows maybe now today that the socialization of boys is changing from what it has been in the past, and that boys are not being allowed to really behave as they had in the past and trying to get their behavior more in line, whereas girls are really the standard, and they are the ones that are seen as the perfect example that boys ought to follow. So I thought it would be interesting. It's not a long video, but it's only 5 or 6 minutes, and just maybe another viewpoint of what our book is trying to get across. As we continue in the chapter, we see gender lessons from peers, and so often these are same-sex peers, as the picture suggests in our book, but you can also see how this would be valuable in socialization for both boys and girls, and how they learn about lessons that are going to help them later in life. Hopefully these would be positive lessons, and again might learn some negative things to avoid as well. The media and gender section just shows really a lack of representation of good female roles for girls and women, that there seems to be an abundance of male examples in whatever type of media you want to look at. Our book gives us some interesting things to look at there in terms of statistics to back this up. It also gives us an interesting chart that we're going to see on the next slide that kind of continues that idea, but it looks not at media so much, but gender stratification in leadership positions. So whether it's government or business or other types of organizations, it seems that men are found very easily in these positions, whereas women are not so much. All right, and I guess what we'll do is I'll flip over real quick to show you that, since that was the first thing on our current slide, and just it'll help to see that now, and then I'll flip back in just a moment. But there you can see almost a 3-to-1 advantage in about everything, and depending on business, it's almost completely all men. I know one other area we could include that would follow up on the organizations would be in Hollywood, but I think it's about the level, maybe not quite 95%, but certainly close to that the last time I was actually made aware of that data. All right, but our book also goes onto the subject of the origins of patriarchy, or a male-dominated society, versus a matriarchy, a female society dominated by women. And so we typically, historically speaking, have always had a patriarchy, and for maybe various reasons. And one of those reasons in our chapter is mentioned when it comes to religion. We don't have much on that in the chapter, but maybe that would be one of the reasons that it happens. And then we do have some matriarchies, but just not in abundance like some of the other charts that we've seen. You can see women in business and organizations and government, but just not widely represented like their numbers in the general population. All right, and then our book also mentions there about how culture trumps biology. And so the idea there, we've looked at a lot of information that really has been looking at between what's biological and what's social, but maybe in the past when there wasn't a lot of technology around, having a lot of muscle strength was maybe a reason that men could, get some advantage over women when it came to work. But now that's really not the case. So a lot of those traits maybe that were based in biology that were necessary in the past are really not so anymore. And so that should lead to a decrease in inequality is really, I think, the idea there. All right, and our book shows us again maybe a chart that is worthy of a few minutes of notice. But, historically speaking, males have really taken advantage of college education, but over the last number of years, that has changed to where females are really the ones who are dominating college enrollment. I think at the college, really it's about getting close to 2-to-1 female to male students, and that is very close to some other institutions that I know, including some of the big universities in North Carolina and some other surrounding southern states. But that is interesting where once a male-dominated field is now becoming female-dominated. All right, and just another interesting chart here that shows employment fields, and there where most women are employed or more women are employed. Not too old of a chart here. This is from 2015, and this might play into some later charts that we have in the book. Is there really a wage gap between men and women? Are men paid more because they're men, and are women paid less because they're women? Are there any differences that should be taken into account? And again, I've listed another video in Blackboard, a short one if you're interested, that you can look at that maybe tries to explain this wage gap that just about we all hear that women make about 77% of what men do. And so it is good to maybe find out some factors that are related. Our book does a good job of doing that tells us some things to think about. And then I think that video is also another good source. And then, of course, you can find some other information outside that too. So I think the more the better to really understand why there is a difference. All right, another nice chart in our book. Nice, but it really gives the information we've seen before is women are not seen in these top positions. That's why it gets so small at the top. And then compared to women employees. One thing our book doesn't touch on, and so much directly, is the fact that women really are the big owners of small businesses. So that's really the backbone of the country. Got to have those. Our book does pick up on women's workforce participation, and of course that is getting higher all the time compared to where it has been in the past. When it comes to culture, power, and gender inequality, some of those topics that our book is always looking at mentions a significant term called the second shift, but it's the idea in the past, women have always been responsible for the homework, that is the child care, that is cleaning and cooking, those very difficult tasks that are taken for granted and not compensated. But women have always done that, but now even when they work outside the home, they still have the majority responsibility of performing all these duties that probably would, if you had to pay somebody who would cook your food for you, clean your clothes, watch your children every day while you went out and worked and did all those other things that we all do, you'd probably have to pay them $100,000 or more per year. And so it is a really valuable service that women do, and the point of the second shift is they're expected to do it. Men do help, but they just simply don't help as much as or do as much as women do for this second shift at home. And so really, if we included that monetary value in the economy, the United States economy would be getting close to doubling from its current, $16 trillion a year. Wouldn't quite double, but it would be close to it. That's how valuable these services are. All right, and our book just shows us, for example, when it comes to legislative bodies around the world, places where women serve the most versus places where they serve the least. At the bottom of the chart, I'll go back real quickly, but it just mentions where the United States stands compared to the rest of the world. So, about middle way. That's kind of surprising. You'd think we would be higher on the list is why I say that it would be surprising. Our book does mention there, again, violence against women and domestic violence and sexual assault is listed there. And unfortunately, we do have a graph that's coming up next, a picture. And it's just a really sad one to look at, but it just shows that around the world, it seems really at bare minimum, the violence that happens against women by someone who knows them, a male partner that knows them. Could be, again, a different partner, but is really about 1 in 4 at the lowest rate. The highest rate, it gets approaching 40%, which is right next to 1 out of 2. Our book does distinguish when it talks about violence, how men and women differ. With women, it's usually over smaller things and lesser forms of violence. And men's actions tend to be more serious and have more physical ramifications attached to it. Our book actually has a term that they mention called intimate terrorism, which seems to be a very highly ironic way to refer to that. Our book also mentions state violence against women, so wherever women live. In the United States, this has recently been phrased maybe in these terms called a rape culture. And that's the idea: do you live in a place where a woman could be raped and there's really no prosecution for what has occurred? And you would hope that that would never be the case within the United States. So, when you hear about tales of rape, of stories of rape, is the person who committed this act, are they prosecuted? If they're prosecuted, then that would tend to say, well, there's not a rape culture. But I know there is some instances where people feel as if that's the case. Now, there are some countries around the world where things like this can happen, and there's actually no prosecution at all. And that, I think, is more in keeping with that term of a rape culture. But certainly you would not want any group of people subjected to one of the worst crimes that could ever occur, and then there be no penalty for what that person has done. Our book also mentions another form of violence against women, maybe that's underreported, is human trafficking and globalization. And again, this is just a sad section in the textbook, but one of the sporting events that I enjoy watching is the Super Bowl, but I was completely unaware of the human trafficking that goes on during the Super Bowl. So every year when that sporting event, now this is not with the sanction of the NFL or anything, but wherever that game is played, there are lots of women that are trafficked to that city where it occurs, and then they are prostituted out during a time that should be fun for everybody, but is not. So I was horrified to learn that that actually has been going on. Genital cutting is something else our book mentions, but again, in societies around the world where men are really seen as kings of society and women are really seen as second-class citizens, it's the idea that women's genitals are mutilated in order to maximize male satisfaction, and often that is very painful for women. It can lead to infections. It decreases their sexual enjoyment. And there's just really no good reason to do that. Men, when they have, for example, some genital cutting, that's really for health purposes for them. But that's not so when it comes to women. So that is something that the United States has tried to help cut out or cut down on. I'm not trying to make a pun or anything, but that's been met with resistance. Some cultural traditions, they're still going to do that, whether we in the United States like that or not. All right, our book switches gears to some terms that we've heard of before. We're making our way to the end of the chapter, but in terms of sexuality, what a person finds arousing is that which we're talking about. So, for example, one's desires, the behaviors that they find arousing, and then again how they identify. Lots of cultures have some behaviors that are off limits, and our book represents that with the incest taboo. And so that would indicate people and the relationships that are off limits for sexual relations. And of course, there's other off limits behaviors that our book mentions. Some are tied to religion. Our book mentions whether people are close enough in family relationships, that often determines the incest, or sometimes it's their age. And our book also mentions some interesting scenarios in which these incest taboos were not held. And maybe today Some of the age requirements, we might be starting to question that. So some of these former off-limit regulations are starting to be questioned again. And that's where I guess maybe the sexuality as a social construction comes into play of when and what is considered okay. This is again on the heels of our chapter of deviance and criminality. But just imagine how different types of sexual behaviors can be approved or not. I know at some time in the United States in the past, only regular intercourse, regular missionary intercourse was an approved way of sexual relations. And if you did anything outside of that, you were really kind of breaking the law. But now how would that type of behavior be monitored? I know within the last few months, and I forget which country it was, but basically this country decided they were going to outlaw oral sex. And the leader of that country basically made the statement that your mouth was used for eating, and that was it. And you shouldn't be using that in any way, shape, or form when it came to sexual behaviors. Our book talks about how sexual norms in the United States have changed. We can call it maybe the sexual revolution, but it started, I know, when my parents were really, really young, but in the late 40s. I mentioned my parents and my grandparents because it's interesting. You can see all these norms from when they were young and what they remember was considered okay or deviant. It's just interesting to think about how much change has occurred over their lifetimes, and of course, the same will be true of us as well when we continue to age. But you probably heard of Alfred Kinsey, and he studied sexual behavior in males and females at a time when you just really didn't talk openly about that. And Kinsey's reputation, there's some who admire him and some who don't. Some who think he was really scientific, and others who maybe think he was just kind of a pervert. We can also see some of the cultures shortly after that. And, of course, some of this rebellion that our book mentions did start to occur in the 60s with the Woodstock generation, where they just didn't want to live like previous generations had before, and this was their revolution to introduce something else. You also see, for example, that reproduction techniques and contraceptives were used to help liberate some women from not becoming pregnant as often as maybe they had sex, but that was something also that women didn't have to fear pregnancy as much. And then, of course, the women's movement, which is ongoing today, and our book has a little description of the three waves of feminism that we'll come to in just a moment. But in my classes, I've always seen the difference between males and females when it comes to sexual behavior is whether you can get pregnant or not. And so I don't think people think of it very much differently than what our book presents. If you're a male, you're not going to get pregnant, and so sex is something that you engage in more frequently than a female, because a female has to, consider that, hey, she could get pregnant. So that's really what my classes have been able to tell me over a number of years, is that, hey, if I didn't have to worry about getting pregnant, then I'd have sex a whole lot more than if I have to worry about it, which is interesting. Again, a common knowledge on this next slide. We've heard of a lot of that. And of course, there's probably some more terms we could find, but we're going to stick with the ones on our slide. But how people identify when they talk about their sexuality. I don't think there's anything here on the chart that we're not familiar with. Our book does go into a discussion about the word homosexual, and of course, and how that's related to heterosexual, but how these words were socially constructed, and it really wasn't until the 19th century until that started to happen. So, is that a social creation? All right, just a little bit of chart that follows up on what we've seen before. Not a whole lot more information there. But here's where our chart follows up is, these terms, hetero and homosexual, were they just recent creations? Were they really describe a new behavior, or was it behavior that's always been with us? And our book does a little bit of background on that, but what they mentioned is, just really that behavior has been around. It's just these terms were new terms to help describe it. So, there were ancient, older words to describe both of these behaviors. So it's not like we have created anything new. It's just we love to name things, and that's the names that it got when some scientists actually started studying this type of behavior. All right, our book does mention the bisexuality and asexuality, so those who are attracted to both versus those who are attracted to none. Sexual identities and inequality. So, for example, we can discuss a lot of how people who are heterosexual may enjoy advantages that people who are same-sex attracted have not. Our book mentions a little bit about that, some of the advancement in rights for homophobia. It's easy to find some movies or books that you could read that would look 50 or 60 years ago in U.S. society and show that how some people with their sexual identity, if it was homosexual, and some of the persecution that they would experience in their job or education or some other aspect of life that maybe we don't see nearly as much today. Sexuality on the internet. Guess what the number one use for the internet is? And if you are thinking or said pornography, then you would be correct. That's kind of a sad fact, but when the internet can lead us to so much, there's also good things and bad things. But our book mentions with pornography, literally it is a writing that excites or gives one sexual excitement. That's a definition that really tells you what's going on. And of course, it can involve males and females in terms of the subjects of this exciting content, but it's usually something that affects women more than it does men. Our book just mentions, and you may have seen it, I have not, I've heard about it, but right now there's some movies out there that maybe kind of give you another good idea of this sexual exciting material, but it's the 50 Shades of Grey movies. I think there's 2 or 3 of them out now. But this is just a good example of how common this type of stuff is that anybody could find it. All right, and now real quickly, I wanted to share one story with you, but just shows you that if you have children or younger siblings, you better talk to them, or else they'll find it from some other source. But have you ever heard of a rainbow party? That's something that details. Our book has a little bit about Oprah, but that was one of the sources I learned about it. And of course, I had a book that I read it about too. But it was how even young children in early grades of school were involved in oral sex. But boys and girls would gather together. The girls would use a different color lipstick, and then the boys would have their genitalia exposed. But that's what they meant by a rainbow party. So think about when you were in 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. Would you be involved in activities like that? But in the world today, that is not all that uncommon. And the book that I read that in was called Epidemic, and it was by Meg Meeker. And she described all these cases where kids were getting cancer and STDs and all sorts of things, but it was from early sexual behavior. So that has always kind of stuck with me about how scary that was for young people to be developing these type of problems so early that could be avoided. All right, as we move on here towards the end of the chapter, we see some more based on inequality here on our gender and sexuality chapter. And so what our book mentions first is gender and sociology, and then on top of that, gender stratification as functional. And so really here we see some names like Talcott Parsons, but it's really talking about the differences that we're going to see. That we remember the chapter on stratification, but really there's going to be some useful strategies for this to take place. We see that stratification was around the world, and that there were some good things from it. Sometimes there's some bad things, so that's also going to happen. Now, what Parsons would indicate here is that some people, because of the stratification in society, they're just going to sometimes automatically accept the roles that they are given. So maybe some of those provide some goals and functions, as we've seen before. And then some of these may lead to situations in which people realize that they're not allowed to do some of the things that they want to do, and they have to fight for those. We also see a point in our book in the slide 2 that of feminist scholarship, and there we just see again why some people would bring up the question of why certain things in life are the way they are. Why can't men do certain things? Why can't women do certain things? Is it because of this patriarchy or gender roles? Is that why you can't do these things that you want to do? So feminist scholarship would ask these questions and has extended to lots of different disciplines into what is possible that people could do if they chose to do so. Our book has a really good description of feminism. A feminist is someone who just simply wants to eliminate inequalities for women. You may think of it as being a female, but it can also be a male. And our book just simply describes the 3 waves. They, for some reason, just talk about it in waves. But the first wave was simply for the right to vote. And then the second wave of feminism, our book labels theirs in the 60s and 70s. That's where you start to go beyond voting into other areas of life where women were not treated equally, and trying to resolve those matters. Some of those might include reproductive rights. The National Organization for Women was created during the second wave of feminism, but those were some of the topics. The third wave, some might just say, is just a continuation of the second wave, but from 1990 and beyond, but really empowering. That's probably a key word that you've heard many times, that you want to empower women. And then, for example, when it comes to sexual behaviors, women should not be thinking negative about themselves. They ought to feel as free and as powerful as typically what men do when they identify with their sexuality. But that was really just a brief synopsis of those 3 waves of feminism. Our book also mentions LGBT activism, and we've got a picture of the White House with the rainbow flag, but really the rights for LGBT people began about 50 years ago, or nearly 50 years ago next year in 2019, but at the Stonewall Inn bar. But there was finally a riot. Some people there at this gay bar finally said enough is enough, and they wouldn't take the treatment that they had been receiving. Our book ends with a couple terms here on this slide, and then we have a few additional slides like normal of reviewing and reflecting everything that we've seen in the chapter. But it really talks about how the sexes are moving together, moving closer towards one another. That's the idea of convergence. So the first one in gender convergence is just saying how similar life is now for men and women. So women, as an example of this, have greater economic activities and opportunities. Men, for example, might have new freedom in gender roles that they maybe haven't had before. So men can take care of their children, can spend time at home doing traditional feminine activities. Women can go to college now more than they ever before, and have better job prospects than ever before. So those are just some examples that our textbook focuses on. And then finally, sexual convergence is, maybe in the past, boys always asked girls out. Now, girls can do that. They can behave more like boys if they want to do that. And then usually now we see that boys may report later ages of their first sexual experiences than what you had seen in the past. And maybe girls also doing it a little bit different before. Instead of waiting, they're actually sexually engaged at an earlier age. So those are a couple things and what our book means by that term, convergence. Our book has, again, a few final slides to review everything. So we did have one article on the two spirits, really highlighting the intersex type idea. We also, for example, see women really to decrease any wage gap. Maybe one of the solutions to that is to go into high-paying fields instead of maybe some that are low-paying. And engineers are certainly one of those careers that does pay more than maybe something else that you could select. All right, and then we did look again. Our author likes to include culture, structure, and power. Power is really important and how that creates inequality. We've seen it in this chapter on gender. So come to the end of another video. So I hope this has been helpful, and if I can help you, of course, please contact me. Thank you and have a good day.